these are wicked people. So we have to somehow bypass them and make an appeal to ordinary human beings who look for faith, who look for religion, who look for salvation, and just say, you're following false leaders. And I'm not saying that'll work. I'm not saying if you would do this, this would succeed. But we've got to separate the corrupt, wicked leadership of these movements from the ordinary people who are not wicked people.
Frank, do you think that it's possible to make that appeal directly to ordinary people and say you were following false leaders without being a religious leader yourself? In other words, is there a secular appeal there, or does it have to come from within the churches, from within the religious community?
My name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Petra Costa. And Petra is a Brazilian filmmaker and actress and member of the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences here. In 2020, her documentary film, The Edge of Democracy, was nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the 92nd Academy Awards and won a Peabody Award. Petra is the director of Apocalypse in the Tropics, which I watched this morning, now playing on Netflix, and everybody needs to see this. You'll understand why when we're done talking here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm asking you now to please subscribe right now on YouTube, where we are going live and where this will be playing forever, or until the world ends or Jesus comes back or whatever happens. And also, please go to Spotify and Apple Podcasts and subscribe. And to my Substack, it has to be said commentary page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. You can also follow my new project, which has just come out on November 1, The Gospel of Zip, at thegospelofzip.com. And that is a book that is for sale on Amazon, but also is a different sort of project because I read the whole thing out loud for 8 hours on YouTube. It's up live and it's free. So I'm not trying to make any money off anybody. You can watch this movie right now for nothing, if you can get YouTube. And that's about it from me. So, Petra, I watched the movie this morning. And of course, the first question I have for you, because it's such an obvious one, is living here in the US as an opponent of the Trump administration and someone partially responsible for the Trump administration, because in my youth, I was the producer and director for my father's film series, which actually formed the American Evangelicals that then you document, that came to Brazil and suddenly started this whole thing. Billy Graham was a family friend, the whole bit. You can go back to any of those people and we knew them. So when I watched the movie, what struck me is of course, it's sort of a piece of my family history, in the sense that we were very influential in the evangelical world, which I left about 40 years ago, but nevertheless, I understand it. So I'm going to start with an odd question that came out of something that Lula da Silva said, and I'm not quoting exactly here. This is as I remember it. He said, the left's mistake was that it ignored faith. And he says that in your movie. And I think, that's what he said. So I agree with him. And I have been trying to argue that with my American friends who are more to the left or came from more of a left-wing secular background, saying that you can't understand why Trump is there unless you understand how angry the evangelical community has been for 50 years at being ignored, and also the kind of arrogance of the secular left, especially in the academic community, and just totally ignoring that part of the culture and not having a conversation with it. So that's not what your movie's about, but I was so struck by the fact that Lula da Silva put this exactly as I would put it, that it sort of jumped out of the movie. So I know it's a weird place to start, and it's not really biographically about you, but I just wanted to ask you, when you heard him say that and you edited into your film, so obviously it was an important statement, at another point, you had said, well, you didn't know anything about the Bible and all these people, so you decided to learn something about evangelicalism. I just want to ask you about that journey and how you interpret what he said about the left's mistake was to ignore faith, in terms of the ramifications of how that played out with these crazy evangelicals and Pentecostals and others, bringing Bolsonaro on the scene and so on. it's all part of one picture, but it also is very much where we are now in the US. So that's, I'm not going
Hmm.
to ask all my questions at such length. I'm going to throw that out to you and just see where you want to go with it.
Yes. Well, first, it's an honor to be here with you. I saw many documentaries about Christian fundamentalism, the evangelical movement in the United States, and through them, I got to know the work that you and your father did,
Yeah.
and read as well about the extreme importance that the documentaries and that you did on abortion like was what really made that turn into the theme that would then be embraced and championed by Jerry Falwell and the creation of the moral majority.
Yeah.
And in the process of watching all that, it was a very uncanny experience because it was watching my present and my future. Because in Brazil, what happened in the United States in the 70s, 80s, 90s
Mm.
started to happen in Brazil only after 2013.
Sure.
That the evangelicals really tried to appropriate themselves out of politics and become a political movement
Mm.
with such force, right? And and what we're seeing play in Brazil is a condensed and very fast version of what has happened in the United States in the past decades. And yes, I think that statement of Lula, that one of the mistakes of the left was to ignore religion, I think summarizes a lot of what I have discovered with my own investigation. Because
Sure.
at first, as a progressive, of course, I was revolted with the rise of the far right and perplexed by it. And then when I tried to understand why did it have and how did it gain working class support,
Yeah.
did I discover it was thanks to the evangelical embrace of the far right, both in Brazil and in the United States. And then when you start to look at it, yes, that also comes from many years of neglect from the left. In Brazil, that played out differently in the sense that there was this whole backlash against liberation theology, right?
Yeah.
There was a very progressive movement inside the
Sure.
Catholic Church that was liberation theology, and and a project from the United States to silence it, and from the Pope as well. Um, but we see the progressive parties very much becoming parties of the elite in the last decades,
Right.
and the far right embracing the working class through its discourse and its actions. I think that's even more accentuated in the United States than it is
Very
in
much so.
Brazil
Yeah. And I
because
saw a
of the
real parallel
two-party
with your
system,
film.
right?
Your friend and producer, Alessandra, is here. So let's let her in and then we'll continue the discussion.
Great,
So
yes.
Ernie's going to bring her in here and then we'll keep going. Alessandra, this is a really international production today because I'm north of Boston and tell me where
I'm
you
in
are.
Rio. I'm in Rio.
You're in Rio and Petra is in an art gallery somewhere for Christmas. And we're talking about the movie. Let me just introduce you. Alessandra Orofino is a non-profit executive activist, director, producer, and writer with extensive experience in advocacy and campaigning. She is a fellow at the Obama Foundation and the Ashoka Network of Social Entrepreneurs. She has a degree from Columbia University in Economics and Human Rights and is the co-writer and producer of Apocalypse in the Tropics, which we are talking about today, and which I watched this morning. And where we began was simply with the question that I brought up to Petra in reference to what Lula da Silva said when he says, in your film, the left's mistake was to ignore faith and ignore religion. And I said, well, the same thing happened here in the US. And of course, my family was a very famous evangelical family. And many historians, like your friend Randall Balmer, who introduced me to you and said, you've got to have Petra on your show, has written books about the fact that, my father's influence and so forth and so on. back in the 1970s, I was part of the religious right myself, and I wrote and directed the film series that made the abortion issue in America, really created the pro-life movement in the Protestant evangelical wing out of thin air. And something I would tell both of you that comes from my personal history that I think would interest you, in terms of the fact that you both become kind of historians and documentarians of this part of history, was that when we made Whatever Happened to the Human Race with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who became Ronald Reagan Surgeon General, and my father, Francis Schaeffer, in the late 1970s, when it was released, our fight was with evangelical Christians who were saying, this is not an issue for us. This is a Roman Catholic issue. Why are you talking about abortion? And we had to convince them to make this an issue. So that I think when you come from the progressive side, you look at the evangelical movement as a sort of a monolithic whole, but it wasn't that. The evangelical movement that we addressed in the 1970s was, all about personal salvation, following Jesus Christ. There were as many evangelicals voting for Democrats as there were for Republicans, and it was the moral litmus test, family values issues, that they used and we used in the same way that Bolsonaro did in Brazil to electrify them on a series of issues that, you're either for abortion or against abortion, for gay rights and again, but that was not the way the evangelical movement was before we got involved. And then, of course, I left that movement and have become a critic of it. And the only reason I'm mentioning that is because I just wanted to say what I said to Petra earlier, and that was the story in the movie that you all made is our story too. It's just the same story later. And the crazy part is so much of that was transposed into the Brazilian context by the influence of American evangelicals, particularly Pentecostal and charismatic Christians. Okay, so that's it. I've introduced you a little bit, Alessandra. By the way, are you Brazilian or Italian? Because you've got an Italian name.
I'm Brazilian. I'm Brazilian.
Okay, but do you have some Italians in your
Oh,
background?
sure. Yeah, my grandparents were Italian. So
Allora bene,
I am technically also Italian. I have an Italian passport, but I never lived in Italy. I don't have that kind of attachment to the country.
Do you speak any Italian?
A little bit, not well.
Parlato italiano poco, bene.
She does. When
Tutto
the
bene.
film premiered in Venice, I could testify. Good Italian.
enough to order at a restaurant and ask for directions, which is
Tutto
all we
bene.
did in Venice.
Tutto bene. So anyway, that's me. This is you. And I just want to tell people again who are just coming in here that this morning I was watching both The Edge of Democracy, but then, of course, the new movie we're talking about, Apocalypse in the Tropics. First of all, I just want to tell you both, as a former documentary filmmaker myself, and I put it this way, I know what I'm looking at, and you guys have done an incredible job. This is an incredible production in both the depth of the intellectual content, but also, who you got access to and how you did all this. You're both, this is a monumental achievement. And I would just tell Americans with access to Netflix that if you want to understand the Trump administration, watch this movie, Apocalypse in the Tropics, because it's our American story. So let me begin.
We should use that quote in our poster.
Yeah, you can. Let me ask you both a question and take whatever order. Now that I've got you both here, how did you connect? What is your story, and why are you working together? Are you always a team? Is this a one-time deal? I don't know your story in terms of how you got together.
Ale, do you want to go for it? And then I wanted to ask you.
You go ahead.
Okay. So. But I also wanted to ask you a question after this, Frank, if I could. But Alessandra, I had great admiration for the work she was doing in the third sector in Brazil. She built an amazing NGO that did all types of grassroots work and pressuring government and legislators to pass laws, such as the law that made feminicide a crime in Brazil. And when I saw her making just a kind of John Oliver Brazilian version with a great comedian in Brazil as a weekly show, but also a very interesting up doc in the beginning of the Bolsonaro government. I asked her if she would be interested in producing this film, and she was, and it was a great partnership because she has a great understanding of the political landscape in Brazil. When we were filming nonstop for 3 years, everything that was happening almost. At first, we started making a film that was just like bearing witness to the horrors of the administration, Bolsonaro's administration during the pandemic. Yeah. And then from the material, we both realized that what called us most our attention was the holy war that was happening.
Yeah.
And,
well, some of the most memorable shots in the movie are watching people kneeling and praying on the street to get rid of the COVID pandemic. And of course, what they needed was vaccines. And now in America, ironically, with the Trump administration, it's turned into an anti-vax administration with Kennedy having, driving our medical profession into hiding, basically cutting funding to today. I just read in the newspaper, they've just cut the funding for the Pediatric Association because they've taken a pro-vaccine approach. I mean, we're in the middle of our own insanity here. It was crazy watching a movie this morning, I'll just tell you, because it was literally not just ripped from our headlines, but it was like just watching a newsreel of my moment now here. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Alessandra, just talk to me a little bit about the production of this film and your involvement in it.
Of course. So as Petra said, we started filming during the pandemic. We didn't really know what the film was going to be. And then little by little, we understood by watching the material that was coming from the team, that was coming, from our cameras, that this kind of strand of faith and religious fundamentalism as it relates to politics was a really big one. And from then, we decided that we needed to talk to people that could help us understand that world. But there was one particular character that Petra had inadvertently filmed with in 2016 that we, whose name we kept hearing in the material, in the interviews that we were having. And that character was Silas Malafaia, who then became a protagonist of sorts in the film. And Silas is one of Brazil's biggest televangelists, has been on TV for 30 plus years. We're all in Brazil very familiar with him. But it was still a shock to see just how far reaching his influence was, including in denominations and churches that were not of the same denomination as himself. So he's more of an influencer than a religious leader in many ways. And his influence inside of government was growing little by little as other Bolsonaro allies were falling. So we decided to reach out to him, and we scheduled the first interview through a reporter that had already done a few interviews with him, and they were all excellent. So we really loved the way that she approached the subject and built a relationship and filmed with him over many years. So that was one piece of it. And that was not only the Silas piece, but a lot of the shoots that we were having here in Brazil were in kind of direct cinema style, very much just essentially bearing witness to those characters, how they moved in the world and what was going on around them. And that was a big part of the production and our efforts. Yeah. But fairly soon into the process, Petra and David Barker, one of our wonderful editors and writers, also realized that we needed other layers in order to tell this story fully. Sure. So not only had we had to produce the direct cinema layer, but we then added a second layer, which was mostly told through the paintings of apocalyptic, passages in the Bible. Of course. That was the kind of the more theological and historical layer, where we go into the kind of the motivations and the story and the context, including the theological context that helps explain these movements that we were witnessing in real life. And then to that, we ended up adding a third layer around the construction and destruction of Brasilia as our metaphor for democracy. And that was also a very interesting thing to understand and to produce around, right? Like, how do we tell that story? And it's one of those things that in the context of the production, you can never really know until it happens. So, Petra had already been playing with this idea of Brasilia, and the fact that the initial plan for Brasilia had a church, a cathedral in the middle, and then they removed it, and all that means for this kind of new country that was trying to understand itself as a nation, and so on and so forth. And then after we had stopped shooting and we were already moving into editing and so on, the invasion of Brasilia happened, and we had to remobilize the entire team and send them to Brasilia to film the kind of destruction of the buildings of the three branches of power, and that ended up being the final scene in the film. So it was an adventure as a production. It was not a linear process by any means, but very much a production that I think needed to be responsive to the creative and also responsive to the world, to what was happening around us. So like two very strong forces that we had to respond to, both Petra's creative mind in collaboration with this wonderful artist that we had in our team. And that was a big force that we had to respond to because a lot was coming out of that. Yeah. And then, of course, the madness, the sheer madness of what was going on around us and the effort to document that.
Yeah, when they were attacking, the capital, the three branches of government in the capital and so forth, obviously, once again, the parallels with what happened here with the storming of our capital by the same kind of people is insane. I mean, there's no other parallel like that exactly somewhere else. But I wanted to bring something up that I think you'll both find interesting too. We did an interview with a woman who is a professor at University of Rome, and her co-writer has had to go into hiding because Putin wants to kill him. And they did a book showing the connection between the American evangelicals in the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 1990s, getting involved with the Russian Orthodox Church and inspiring them to become social activists that have now supported Putin in his war on Ukraine. And there's an exact parallel with the story in Brazil. And again, it's American evangelicals like Dr. Dobson from Focus on the Family, also a friend of mine back from the past, from years ago when I was involved.
From the family.
Yeah.
The fellowship.
Yeah, when from the 1990s on, he was meeting with the bishops in Russia saying, we want you to be part of our fight on abortion, gay rights, and these other issues. It was exactly the parallel. And her book lays out very clearly.
What is the name? I'd love to.
Ernie will put it into the notes here for me.
Fascinating.
Great.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that this story has repeated in two completely different cultures, which had traditional church structures, the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow, with Archbishop Kirill on one hand, and then, of course, the Roman Catholic Church in Brazil. Now, in Russia, there is not a big charismatic evangelical movement, but there has been American influence to create this kind of level of social warfare, which the church is using as an excuse, and which is why people like Tucker Carlson and American right wing support Vladimir Putin, because he too is anti-gay, anti-trans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he is a totally insincere man, as obviously Bolsonaro was as well. But it follows very much the same pattern. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yes, it's quite amazing how I feel American has thought out and invested and financed the rise of religious fundamentalism around the world.
Yeah.
And not just Christian, right?
Much the same story. So you had a question earlier and I cut you off because
I did. I would love to I have two actually, if you can choose. But so you asked me, how did I see the mistakes of the left? But you seem to have very strong opinions about that as well. I would love to know how you see the mistakes of the left regarding the religious population and or specifically the evangelical population, and also what made you come out of the religious right.
Okay, well, I'm 73, so I have an excuse. If I forget the second question, you can remind me.
Yes.
By the way, Dr. Christine Stokely, and her book is called The Moralist International, Russia and the Global Culture Wars, Orthodox Christianity and Contemporary Thought. That's what you're asking about.
Thank you.
She teaches in Rome University, and she's a brilliant woman, and lots of people watched her interview with me. But her book is absolutely amazing because, it's something that I knew a little about, but I didn't understand the close collaboration between the Russian Orthodox hierarchy and American far-right evangelicals as early as the 80s and 90s. And which had
Fascinating. Yes,
resulted
I
in,
had never heard about that.
yeah, so you should check her book out. Anyway, okay, so your question was why did I come out of this and how did I, and change and so forth. But before that, you wanted to know my opinion. I think that I read a book recently called Dominion by Tom Holland, who's the United Kingdom's premier historian of Rome and Roman civilization. And he has a podcast called The Rest is History with Dominic Sandbrook, which is the #1 podcast in the world right now.
We love it.
Mm-hmm.
So Tom Holland wrote a book called Dominion. And the subtitle of the book is How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And it's probably the most interesting and best book I've read in 10 years. If I was just going to give anybody one book to read, nonfiction, that actually will inform you of something, it would be Tom Holland's book. Tom is not an evangelical Christian. He's not a believer. He's a historian of Rome. He's an academic. Center left, maybe, something like that. And if you listen to the podcast, you know who he is. All right. But when he was doing the history of Rome and tried to chart what it was about Western civilization that actually fundamentally changed, why we don't have a legal slave trade anymore, why, you can't rape your housemaid and get all these sort of ethical changes from Roman times to our own. He was saying it was in the influence of Christianity for all its failings was inescapable. And that basically the big fallacy of the Western humanist, or you might say progressive left today, our biggest mistake, because I'm part of that group, is to pretend that somehow the values that we call Enlightenment or Renaissance values came out of nowhere, that credit has to be given to Christianity, even in the oblique sense, coming to something like gay marriage or feminism, that this doesn't come from nowhere. This is the logical progression of the teachings that the last shall be first, that the least of these should be given attention, that individuals are created in the image of God and so forth. That essentially, even when those are put in a secular context, one still has to look at, with honesty, at the Christian context that changed the culture. So Dominion is this, I got a copy of it here. I listen to I do Jeannie, my wife Jeannie and I listen to a lot of books. So we listened to it, but then I reread it. But I would just say that's the point I'm trying to make, that Tom Holland makes so well. And that is where the academic left, particularly I'm talking about the US that I know better, and Great Britain I know as well, made their mistake, was basically in saying, we've done something new, and becoming very arrogant and moving away from the basic commonality of experience. So if you look at someone like Voltaire, for instance, or Montesquieu or Rousseau, these are all Christian heretics. But what they left was the Christian faith, and their criticism of Catholicism didn't come from Mars. It came from saying, you have not lived up to the teachings of Jesus. In other words, their criticism was the criticism of the church for being hypocritical. And it's the same of the abolitionists in the slave trade in America. The British abolitionists like Wilberforce were calling for the abolition of the slave trade based on the fact that we can't call ourselves a Christian nation if we're going to have slavery, because this is a hypocrisy. So what Tom really points out well, and Dominion is such a good book. I mean, it's a really good book, that basically when you're finished that, you have to then really think about the fact that the mistake of the left to put Trump in power in America, I won't talk about Brazil because I don't know that situation except for your movies and what I read in the newspapers, was basically 50 years of fury from a group of people who were ignored on the sort of working class level, but also just intellectual people like C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, my father, Francis Schaeffer, and others. Bill Buckler, who started the National Review, some of these intellectual Catholics who I was friends with back in the 80s, and we knew him very well because he also lived in Switzerland. Their level of anger with the left was that the left would never credit them with anything. And I think the biggest example you see, and then I'm going to shut up, but you asked me, so I'm going to tell you. The biggest example of this where it really, really drove it over the cliff was the unthinking embrace of the sexual revolution of the 1970s by the left, starting with as if somehow this was a pushback against the constrictions of Christianity, when of course, that same sexual revolution winds up now, fast forward, ironically, with Trump and his accusations of rape, the way he treats women, and all the rest of this. So what Tom Holland is talking about is, look, we have to take a deep breath and step back and give credit where credit is due on this. And that's what his book is about. So basically it traces the history. And he's not at all saying, Christianity is great and everything else become great. That's not his point of view. But he's talking about the historical context with what we regard as liberal left-wing rights and these sorts of things. So that's basically where my head has been at on this. And I think he's made a very good point.
Thank you. I wonder though if, because for example, Jerry Fowles seemed to have a very strong plan that didn't necessarily have to do with the morality of abortion to begin with, right? From what I understand from Randall Balmer, exactly, his issue was with segregation, and then he used the abortion myth, as they call it, as the uniting force between Christians.
And it was fundraising too. It was to make money. You have to understand the leadership and the people are two different things. So when you're looking at the people that were swayed by Bolsonaro, they're completely different than him and his friend Malafi. How do you say his name properly?
Malafaia.
Yeah, Malafaia. These are bad people.
But today, if you were going to give an advice to the left, what would be your advice today?
So forget the leadership. They're totally corrupt on the right.
Mm-hmm.
These are money grubbing con artists. And when you look at Malafaia, he's a scary far right person who, if he had his way, it would be Handmaid's Tale. There would be people hanging from bridges. They would kill us. These are wicked people, and they are not about either Christianity or human rights. This is just straight up pre-Christian paganism reborn in a Christian form. These are Romans fighting over the empire. These are Vikings doing their funeral celebrations where women are being thrown into the tombs with their men and the rest. They have returned to a pre-Christian love and worship of power and violence. These are wicked people. So we have to somehow bypass them and make an appeal to ordinary human beings who look for faith, who look for religion, who look for salvation, and just say, you're following false leaders. And I'm not saying that'll work. I'm not saying if you would do this, this would succeed. But we've got to separate the corrupt, wicked leadership of these movements from the ordinary people who are not wicked people.
Mm-hmm. Frank, do you think that it's possible to make that appeal directly to ordinary people and say you were following false leaders without being a religious leader yourself? In other words, is there a secular appeal there, or does it have to come from within the churches, from within the religious community?
Well, I think there is a secular appeal, but it depends how it's couched. I think that, first of all, if you're talking to people who are believing Christians, you have to say we would not have our modern idea of human rights without the teachings of Christ. We would not have this idea that the least of these, that it's not about power and domination. Without this part of Western civilization. I mean, look, I've in my new book, The Gospel of Zip, what I talk about is, just because you've asked me about my opinion. My opinion is this: the reason the teachings of Jesus resonate today with people is not because Jesus is the Son of God, because I don't believe he is, nor because that teaching is unique. It's because human evolution itself and our survival depends on one thing, and that's not the survival of the fittest. It's the survival of the friendliest. It's our ability to cooperate that means that the three of us are having a discussion. We'd all be dead if someone in our deep past had not picked up one of our ancestors who broke their femur and took them to a hut somewhere and nursed them. That's your great, 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 great grandfather or great grandmother. That's why we're here, because someone cared. So if you look at another book I really love, which is The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, she lived with the Sand people in the Kalahari Desert in the 1950s. So this is pre-feminism, pre-everything we're talking about. And what she found there in this hunter-gatherer group that had been doing the same thing for 100,000 years in that desert. And she and her parents, her father was the founder of Raytheon, went to live with them for a year and study them because her mother was into this, anthropology and so forth. What they found was basically people living as if they were following Jesus. She doesn't put that in her book, but they're taking care of each other. Old people are cared for. Women have rights and careers, by the way, because they're the gatherers and the hunter-gatherer thing. The men don't dominate. The men help with childcare. The elderly take care of the children. It isn't perfect. There's problems, but they're not the problems of a lack of civility or kindness. So basically, my own point of view is that the reason the teachings of the New Testament resonate so widely is because they draw people back to what we already know is true. And that is that civility, kindness, empathy works. And in the long run, everyone is happier in a system like that. Where the left makes a mistake is in not crediting the fact that Christianity re-articulated that basic knowledge. And we need to give due credit to where it's due. So basically, I can tell people today that I myself am a follower of Jesus Christ. But that doesn't mean I'm a Christian. It means that I find in those teachings an articulation of the way it's why my 56 years of marriage with Jeannie has worked. Because I was born to be, I was groomed to be an asshole by divine right. Men are in charge, blah, 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 blah. And it worked, and we're still married, and we're passionately in love with each other. And I do childcare for my grandchildren, but this doesn't come out of a vacuum. And it's not because I believe Jesus was the Son of God. It's because living according to those principles actually works, because it ties in with a much deeper truth, who we are as human beings. It's what we all long for. We want to be surrounded by people who treat us this way. And that's the appeal we can make. And that's what I've been writing and talking about. So that's the long answer. But Wonderful. Now we got to get back to your movie. I'm not interviewing myself here.
Please, yes. Yeah. So our film was just shortlisted for the Academy, which we're very glad about. That news came out on Tuesday. And it's wonderful to see that you saw so many resonances with the United States. We do feel it is a mirror to what is happening there, but with a different ending.
Well, I had a question for you in terms of access to all these people. How did you get access to everybody?
Assaulted democracy was condemned to 7 years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Alessandra, how did you get access to everybody?
Do you want to answer, Ali?
Yeah, of course. So access to Silas, the televangelist at the center of the film, was something that we built slowly over time, initially through this incredible reporter who introduced us to him, and then we built that relationship over time. He, of course, sits on a very different side of the political spectrum than us, and that was something that he knew about. I think that he thought, I always say that I think it was really helpful that he was mostly dealing with 3 relatively young women, me, Petra, and Ana Virginia. Yeah. And to a certain extent, I think he underestimated us, and that helped us get that access. Sure. And then we had some access to other people in the political world, including President Bolsonaro during the presidency, through him, because he had that access that was, of course, free access, essentially. So we were with him in the private plane, in the meetings that matter, where they were kind of scheming to get an evangelical pastor in the Supreme Court and all of that. Yeah. But Petra had actually already interviewed the president, then President Bolsonaro, before he was president, back when he was just kind of a congressman that no one really cared about and everyone thought was a bit of a goof and a clown. Other figures, including Lula, we had to build that access through other means. Of course, Petra had already filmed of Lula extensively for The Edge of Democracy, but it was still hard to get access to him. He was also in prison for a big part of the shoot, and then we were already shooting the film when he got out of prison and was not only released, but freed of the charges against him. And so that was also a bit of a twist in the story that we were able to witness. And then we built that access after he was released. And so on and so forth. There was also the matter of filming crowds. We have a lot of crowd scenes in the film, and that is not really a question of access in the same way that it is for a particular character or person, but it still matters. How do you actually build the possibility of filming in a crowd, particularly maybe a hostile crowd, as in many cases of these kind of far-right protests, and these were pretty hostile crowds, and we faced some difficult situations there, including towards the end when we filmed January 8th, the invasion of the Capitol, an attack on our team with one of the invaders attacking our our director of photography and chewing on the memory card so that we would lose the material. So we had all kinds of interesting moments during filming. And access was a constant kind of, a constant worry in our minds. But we're dealing with pretty mediatic, narcissistic people most of the time.
While you were, they wanted you to talk to them, but I'm just curious. I want to ask you both about the present situation, because Lula da Silva's president now, and your movie has come out, so it's being shown on Netflix. What's been the reaction to the film in Brazil?
Well, it's been very interesting. The film was watched widely in Brazil, was one of the top most watched, not only documentaries, but just most watched pieces of content on Netflix when it came out. And that kind of wide distribution has ignited a pretty interesting public conversation. Silas Malafaia, the pastor in question, was included in the federal police's investigation on the attempted coup d'etat a few weeks after the film came out. And a scene that we shot in the film was cited in that police report. So that was an interesting, follow-up from that. He's been very much I think considered very differently as part of the public debate around religion and politics and the emergence of the far right since the film came out. We've also seen some interesting commentary and reactions from within the religious field. And that was something that we expected, but not quite in the way that it developed. We had, for instance, a few screenings in churches and observed, including in social media, a very healthy, robust debate around the role of faith and the role of politics in churches, not from a standpoint necessarily of protecting democracy, but from a standpoint of protecting the faith. So this conversation around the corruptive powers of power itself and how seeking political power can sometimes lead to a change, a very fundamental change in what the church should be for. And that's a very live conversation here, for sure.
Yeah, because obviously, in watching your film, you could make the argument, and I'm sure people took this in Brazil, and you can tell me when you say church, do you mean the Roman Catholics or the Pentecostal charismatics, but maybe both. But I think one thing the film shows very clearly is that if you really want to damage the witness of Christianity on a spiritual level, do what Malafaia did, because this, you have destroyed the spiritual capital that makes Christianity unique and attractive, because now you've just brought it down to the level of the most basest grab for power. And I'm sure that that's part of the argument.
What's fascinating was that Malafaia was a critic of that himself in the beginning of his career. As a preacher, he would criticize the involvement of preachers, pastors in politics, the excessive ambition, things like that, and transform throughout.
Yeah, what I found,
decades.
when I was watching the movie, obviously, because my father was not quoted in the film, but when Malafaia and these other people were talking about the 7 mountains and the culture and the politics. Of course, that's taken straight out of my father's book, A Christian Manifesto. This is the argument of whatever happened to the human race, how should we then live in a Christian manifesto, which were all bestsellers in America. So all the American Christians who went down to Brazil, the message they were carrying were crafted by my dad.
That is incredible. That is just incredible. And then to see it come out of his mouth so spontaneously, right? Like the moment when he tells us about the mountains, and essentially the whole dominionist theory is he's driving his car. Yeah. It's not even during a sermon. And it's already part of the culture here. So that's how ideas disseminate, I guess.
And a little road rage with a motorcyclist.
Yes. Yes.
And that would bring me to the question, like, what made you come out of that path of part ways with that religious right?
There wasn't one thing or one moment, but basically, first of all, I'm an artist. I'm a painter. So I was having some shows in Switzerland and in London and in New York, and I had some success as an artist. And of course, in meeting other artists, my parents gave me the freedom to do that. So thank God for that. They were pro-art, which was one of the reasons they were so attractive to so many young people in the 60s and the 70s. So the Brie Fellowship, where I grew up in Switzerland, was sort of a fundamentalist commune, but it was a hippie commune. We had, British rock and roll people, all sorts of people there. So, it was when it came to the arts, my dad was living what he called Malafaya to do 30, 40 years later, which is take over the arts. He was giving lectures on Bob Dylan. And, no other Christians were talking about this. He was very attractive to the people. So I was an artist. So first of all, I kept that sort of company. But the real thing that happened is that, I found that when I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18, and here we are 56 years later, still together with 5 grandchildren and 3 grown kids. But, I was just such an asshole in my early years of my marriage. And really began to look at myself and say, what is it about what I supposedly believe that has turned me into this world-class jerk who is not the person Jeannie should be married to? She's stuck with me, and I really felt bad about it. And as I began to unpack that, it was very personal. It was, this theology of male domination and patriarchy is poison. And I have been told by my theology that all my worst instincts as a human male, irrespective of belief, are correct, that this is God's will. You're supposed to dominate your wife, tell her what to do, boss your children around, slap them if they misbehave. And I really, really began to rebel, first of all, against just be angry with whatever had contributed to that. So that was the beginning of my questioning about 10 years into my marriage. And then the second thing is that I knew Jerry Falwell, I knew Billy Graham, I knew all these people personally. They used to come to my father. I met with all of them. And the Dominionists, Rousseff Rushdoony, all of these people were family friends. I would know them all. And they all followed Dad and they all knew me. And I was this young, bright, rising star. So people would say, oh, the mantle is passed, you're going to be the next thing. So Pat Robertson of the 700 Club, Jerry Falwell, they all asked me to be on their board when I was 23, 24 years old.
Oh my God.
Okay. So basically the thing that then was weird for me is that it was like, I'm going to become one of these people. And by that stage, I knew they were thieves, liars, flakes, power hungry, complete liars. Pat Robertson had a diamond mine in South Africa. He was running, he made $1 billion that they bought with the money that people sent them as donations. I mean, these guys all make Malafaya look like nothing. And they wanted power. And so they could care less about gay rights or no gay rights. They knew that by stirring up that kind of hatred, they could come to power. And Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, Dr. Dobson, these guys were all family friends. I was on the 700. So basically, I am an asshole treating my wife awfully, and I want to change. I'm working with people who are making me very successful, what I called God cash. There was a lot of money around and so forth and so on. And I really, really began to rebel against becoming this kind of person. Now, here's the weird thing. The reason why is because my parents had many weaknesses and they were wrong about a lot of things, but they were not thieves. They were not flakes. So when I compared this big time American leadership to the way I grew up in this little humble mission in Switzerland, where we didn't eat meat very often because we couldn't afford it. It was very simple. My parents never took any money. They weren't thieves. They lived in two
Your
rooms.
father had a true Christian belief, right?
Yeah, he had a true Christian
Frank,
belief. He had no
I'm
car.
gonna have to leave, unfortunately, because I have something. But Alessandra's gonna continue, so we're gonna swap.
Well, you
from the
were here
beginning.
before, so we'll be back in touch.
Exactly.
And Alessandra,
This was truly an honor, Frank.
Hey, listen, do me a favor, Petra, sometime get in touch with Ernie because we always ask our guests to give us the names of other guests we should be talking to.
Yes, yes. And if we could have a private conversation about our film's impact campaign, we would love as well.
Anytime. Just Ernie will email you my email and also my cell phone, and we can talk anytime because I love the movie. I'd do anything for it.
Thank you, Frank.
Well, thank you. I truly appreciate it, Frank.
Alessandra, don't go away.
No, I'm here.
You are a living myth. A living myth. It's truly an honor. Bye.
Hey, it's been great talking with you. So, Alessandra, talk to me a little more about what's going on in Brazil right now, because a lot of people watching would be interested in what you think of Lula da Silva at this moment and what's happening.
Yeah, so I mean, the background here for those of you who don't follow Brazilian politics as closely is that Lula has been president since 2023. He was elected again in 2022.
Yeah.
Under the Brazilian constitution, you can have two consecutive terms as president. But then, in our case, if you leave politics, you can come back for 2 more consecutive terms and so on and so forth. So he already had 2 consecutive terms back in 2002 up until 2010. Then he left the presidency and now he's back for his first term in the second round.
Yeah.
And he is almost certainly going to run for re-election next year. So we have presidential elections again in October 2026. Bolsonaro has been convicted for attempted coup d'etat, along with generals and other top military officials and a lot of citizens who stormed the Capitol buildings during January 8th. So some of these citizens and generals and so on are in jail, and Bolsonaro is himself in prison right now, serving his sentence. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison. There is now an attempt at the Brazilian Congress to essentially change the law to make the kind of jail time for the crimes that he was convicted for less severe. So essentially to ensure that he leaves jail in maybe 2 to 3 years. Yeah. That is now what the political class in Brazil is trying to achieve. And the fact that Bolsonaro is out of the game, so he cannot run next year, for obvious reasons, has left the far right in Brazil kind of kingless. So there is a succession fight playing out as we speak. Yeah. And there are a few potential candidates for the far right that come less from the far right and more from the traditional right, and that have alliances with the far right. Yeah. But they represent a more kind of traditional centrist, more traditionally pro-business kind of element in the Brazilian right. And I think the biggest figure in that camp is the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio, who is a possible candidate. Now, the Bolsonaro family is split, and there is a possibility that one of Bolsonaro's sons will run. But really, the strongest candidate they have at this point is Bolsonaro's wife.
Yeah, and she's a super Pentecostal.
Exactly.
Christian,
she's the most religious one.
She's the real deal.
She's the one who kind of got him to the faith, and she was a part of Silas's church. Before she met Bolsonaro, Silas was, in fact, the pastor who celebrated their marriage.
Sure.
So she's pretty religious and has a strong backing from the religious base that elected him in the first place. And I think she would be a very dangerous candidate. But we don't know what's going to happen there. And there is so much infighting in the far right right now that kind of fratricidal infighting might actually come to Lula's advantage. Another thing that has helped Lula's popularity enormously is actually the relationship with Donald Trump. So Trump
Of
imposed
course.
40% tariffs on Brazilian products a few months ago, and explicitly asked that the case against Bolsonaro be dropped. Otherwise, he would continue to punish the country with tariffs. The case was not dropped. Lula didn't cave. And now the tariffs were dropped regardless, mostly because it wasn't helping things in the US inflation-wise,
Right.
that the Brazilian exports were being tariffed at that level. We are the biggest commercial partner of the U.S. on certain categories, including things
Sure.
like coffee, that are really important and that people feel the price of very closely. So the
Yeah.
tariffs are dropped. So the perception in Brazil is that Lula won that fight without having to cede ground, and that has made him quite popular
Well, of
as
course,
someone who
Trump
didn't
sees
cave.
himself in Bolsonaro because, if justice were done in the US, he'd be in jail too for
Yeah,
inciting an
and that is.
insurrection. So, they're the
Yeah,
same
and that
guy.
is a common sentiment. Although I would say, Frank, and I know this is not a popular thing to say in the U.S., but I would say that what Trump did doesn't really compare. I mean, Bolsonaro went a few steps beyond, and I'm
No,
not
no,
saying
I
that
know
what
he
Trump.
did. I
Yeah,
know he did. Yeah. And
there
your
was an
movie's
actual
about
plan
that.
to assassinate Lula, assassinate the vice president. There was a meeting with the top generals to discuss the possibility of a coup d'état. Like, he really plotted a coup
Yeah,
in
he did.
every single aspect of it in a way that I'm not sure that we have the evidence that Trump did in the same way.
Yeah, I don't, and I'm not someone who thinks Trump did that either. I just
Mhm.
think, unlike Bolsonaro and who had an idea of power. Trump is just about himself. If he can profit off a situation and Jared
Exactly.
Kushner can make a deal with the Saudis, no problem. Hey, it was almost like something out of our cartoon because I grew up in Switzerland. The Swiss had a 35% tariff hit against them. They sent 3 Swiss billionaires to the White House. One of them brought a gold bar with President Trump's numbers for presidency on it, and another brought a handmade $250,000 desk clock from Rolex, and it was the Trump the
It's like
tariff.
it's a twisted version of the three. How do you say that in English? The biblical
Yeah,
passage, the three kings.
that's it. And so the tariffs have been waived. I mean, it's like so Trump is not a serious person. The problem is America used to be a serious country, and we're paying for it.
Yes. Well, that's quickly falling off the rails, I
So
must
let me
say.
ask you a question about your own life as a filmmaker because I'm just so interested in you and Petra. But let me talk to you since I've got you here, Alessandra.
Of
Um,
course.
you're a young filmmaker, but you're being very successful. This film's been nominated again for at the Academy and so on. How do you feel just about your own art? I mean, how do you see being a movie maker these days? Do you want to make features? What's in the best of all worlds? What are you going to be? How does this work for you? Because anybody that watches your movie will know that you two are brilliant filmmakers. That's beyond dispute. And it's a fantastic piece of work and courageous. I mean, unbelievable what you've
Thank you
both
so
done.
much, Frank.
So I'm just stunned. And in this sense, it's a real honor to be talking to you. But I just am asking you as a filmmaker and an artist, what you're all about. What do you want to do?
I'm all about the impact, really. Like, for me, this is definitely, I see film and TV too. I'm not precious about it. I think I see this particular, I see storytelling, I guess, more
Mm,
broadly
mm,
as a very strong way of having an impact, maybe the most important one. And stories build nations, they build identity, they
yeah.
build affiliation, they build political movements, they build our very idea of democracy and progress and what we want to be.
Hmm.
And those are all based on stories that we tell ourselves, that capture the public's imagination. I
Yeah.
think to a large extent, the power of the Bible itself and religion is also religion as a vector for storytelling,
Sure.
for some very powerful storytelling that has shaped who we are, right, as a people.
Yeah.
So I take storytelling very seriously. I think it's
Mm,
one of the most human things you can do is to tell a story, and to
yeah.
tell it well and to tell it broadly is very powerful.
Mm,
And this medium is particularly suited to telling stories to broad audiences.
sure.
So I love it, and I'm particularly drawn to artists like Petra who can combine this this very kind of, this very thoughtful way of thinking about their art and their own voice, and the kind of the mastering of the craft, I guess, with a sense of audience, of who's actually on the other side watching this, and how do I reach people's hearts and minds, and in a way that feels that is broad enough, right? So that she's not a niche filmmaker. She is a filmmaker that is trying to speak to the crowds, but without giving up on the artistic elements that make her films hers. And I have worked with other people like that in the past. And as a producer, as a screenwriter, I love writing for other voices. I was the showrunner for a comedy news show in Brazil for 7 years. And a very popular comedy show with like last week, John Oliver, but for a Brazilian audience. And we have a comic who is sitting there every week and going over the kind of news of the week and reflecting on these things. And I was showrunner, meant that I was producing, directing, but also doing the final pass on the script. So I'm used to writing something that has to feel true and be true for other people. And that's something that we also do in this film, right? Like, it's narrated by Petra, but the script was written by a team. And that to me is such a beautiful thing too. There's something about cinema in particular, where the kind of collaborative aspect of it is also fascinating. It's one of those, I think, the few art forms where you just don't go anywhere without collaboration. There's no way you can make a film by yourself, whereas you can definitely write a book or paint a painting or even do a dance by yourself. So this is the realm of collaboration, which I also love, because it allows us to be more strategic about where our strengths are and how do we get to audiences. So for me, that's all it's all about.
When you came out of this project, interviewing all these religious leaders and so forth, my question to you, and you can answer this any way you want or not answer it at all, but I just wondered what your own views are in terms of spirituality. So I would describe myself these days as an atheist who prays. In other words, my mother raised me to pray. And so I pray for my children and grandchildren. And I believe that, this is a good thing. Sometimes I feel those prayers are listened to. Other times I don't, intellectually speaking. Most of the time I would say, no, I don't actually believe there's a God there. But then on the other hand, what do I know? I could be wrong. But I'm just wondering, you obviously have given some spirituality thought because you've been swimming in this this river for 4 years now. Where are you at?
So I was raised differently from Petra. Petra was raised in a secular atheist household. I wasn't. I was raised in a Catholic household, and particularly my grandmothers were really important to me, and both are religious. And so I went to church, and I feel connected to the Catholic community and that identity. It's interesting because when I was about to do my first communion, there was this conversation in the family about choice. And when I had my own kids, I have 2 kids, 2 little girls. When I had my own kids, we also had a conversation about choice and whether or not they should be baptized or whether we should wait, and so that they could make their own choices around the faith that they wanted to follow. And I ended up baptizing them. Well, the second one hasn't been baptized yet because she's 1, but she will be. And I ended up baptizing them. And to me, the reason was that, of course, I would respect any choice that they make in the future around faith or any other aspects of their lives. But I want them to know that they were born in a community, and that they come from that. They may choose to walk away from that or change it or do something else. But I don't know that we choose community in that kind of neoliberal way of like, I have almost like a product of consumption, right? Like, you don't choose, you were born in a community and that is chosen for you. And it doesn't mean that you are bound to it and that you can leave it or question it or change it from within too. But it is important. And that is, I guess, how I feel about my own religion and my own religious affiliation. It's the communal aspect to me is more important than faith itself. I think what I do believe in God and I do pray, but I'm not particularly religious on my day-to-day life. But I really love this idea of having a sort of affiliation for a community that also raised me and helped me become who I am, and gave me values that are still important to me. So that is how I see it. Now, of course, shooting for this film and then editing it and being immersed in a very different kind of religious world, where it wasn't just evangelical, which is a different kind of, different take on Christianity, let's put it that way, but also particularly within fundamentalist circles, which are not by any means the totality of the evangelical church, but on the evangelical churches, I should say. But that world of religious fundamentalism is so different because it of course, community is also very important, but it is very much about the dogma, to the point, and I think that is the main weakness that they have, and we saw this, right, where they are very much willing to part ways with community members when they step out of line. And that to me feels like such a huge violence, right? Like your community should welcome you, including when you fail, including when you disagree, and the fact that dogma is the central aspect of that, and that if you stray away from it, you can be excommunicated so easily. That to me feels particularly violent. It has nothing to do with the political aspect, so it wasn't the object of the film, but it was, for me, one of the most personal aspects of making the film, meeting so many people who had lost their community, lost their churches, because also as the churches became more political, they started mixing their theological views with their political views. So straying away from the political view also became a form of treason, and therefore reason to be excommunicated. So that was an interesting, pretty personal aspect of it for me as well.
Yeah, and that's exactly the way I see things too. Of course, in the evangelical community, especially the Pentecostal, it's a series of personality cults. All these churches, the head of the church, it's a series of personality cults. There is no structure.
Yeah.
And unlike the Roman Catholic Church, I'll be back in Rome again in a little while. And last time I was there last year, when you go into a Roman Catholic Church,
it's very impersonal in a way.
Pardon me?
It's very impersonal. I mean, in the sense that there is no single personality
but no one is asking you if you have a correct series of ideas that afternoon. And the thing is, from my point of view, spirituality, when I look how I've changed my minds about certain things, it's a journey. So when someone quotes a piece of a book of mine that I wrote 20 years ago, and they say, well, you said this. And I say, yeah, well, that's what I was saying then. But this is now, and I'm at a different place because, and I think the Roman Catholic Church is brilliant in that sense, that it allows for the spiritual journey within the structure. It's not as fixed. So there's plenty of room for you in the Roman Catholic Church now, given your views. Because it's not just a dogma. By the way, how are the girls doing?
They're doing great. They're wonderful.
So how old is the oldest child?
The oldest one is 7, and my youngest is 1.
That's great.
Meaning that I was pregnant when we were finishing this film, and I was very pregnant when we released it at Venice Film Festival last year. So it's been quite a journey. And Petra was pregnant when we started it.
Yeah.
So our pregnancies kind of bookended the project in this very interesting way. And it was funny because so much of what we heard in churches was about humans' bodies and our own autonomy over our bodies. Sure. And we both went through pregnancies during the project and also had girls. I think that it's not explicit in the film in any way, but I would say that it very much informed our view of what
where
we
you
were
coming
witnessing.
from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
and as parents and as mothers, you have a stake in the future.
Exactly.
I mean, it's because I feel the same thing with my grandchildren now. Our kids are raised, and I have 3 of my 5 grandchildren live, in my neighborhood, and I've been doing all their childcare for 17 years with my wife.
Oh my God.
So they've never had a babysitter.
Oh, I love that.
Well,
I love it. I love that. And that is very rare, particularly for men, I think. I mean, both my mom and my mother-in-law are very much involved in raising my girls.
Yeah.
My father-in-law, who's a wonderful man, and my dad are great, loving grandparents,
Yeah.
but they're not involved in the day-to-day in the same
Well, I
way.
am, and my wife has been very much too, and she did a lot, and I did a lot. She took an early retirement. She was running a small publishing company because she said, what other chance do I have to do this? And
Yeah, this is the most wonderful thing you can
who
do.
cares about work? Where I'm doing this, and I did the same thing. And I did
Oh,
it
I love
years
it.
ago with my own kids. I was going to move to LA because I made 4 feature films in Hollywood, had an agent. Basically, I'm a failed film director, but I mean, I was working and making money. But I didn't move because I wanted to raise my kids in a smaller neighborhood,
Yeah.
and basically was glad I was able to work as a writer instead. Um, but that said, I found for me personally, I'm 73 years old, different parts of your life are interesting, but the only thing that really gets my attention is my children and grandchildren. And I've had such a close relationship with my grandchildren. One of my grandchildren, 17 years old right now, and when she gets a headache at school or migraine or something, they call me to come get her. And the other day, when she got in the car, she said, "Well, Mom warned me you might not come because it's 45 minutes in each direction. So it's a big commitment. She might not come because you've already been to the school twice that day from my sister and her brother." And she said to her, "I told my mother, of course, Ba," she calls me Ba, "of course, Ba will come." And she
Oh, I
counts
love
on me.
that.
Well, this room here, which is my studio, I would walk around this room while she slept in my arm every single day. This is where she napped. And, we're like this. And there's nothing else in life that's even close. I mean,
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, they're the lights of my life. I love my work and I love doing it. But it's not comparable in terms of, I
no.
also do it for them in so many ways, right? Like that's why I'm about the impact. That's the thing that drives me. Also because I feel like we have a
Yeah.
duty to that
Yeah. And when
generation
I
to do
watched the
what we
movie you
can.
made, yeah, you're fighting for your children.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, I mean, you are. That film is I don't think people will understand how significant that movie is until they see it. But in the context of Brazil, you've really made something important. I think it's going to actually change things there, the way people think. You were talking about how do you reach out to people. And I think your film can change something. I mean, I
I hope
think people
so.
looking at that will walk away. There will be people who are evangelical Christians or in the Pentecostal movement who will look at that movie and they will think a little bit, I think. I mean, that must be the reaction.
I think so. I mean, that's what we saw in some of the churches where we showed the film and also just in the chatter on
Yeah.
social and so on. And it's such an interesting, the conversation is so different around the film within religious communities and outside of them.
Yeah.
And it's but the conversation is happening within and without. So it's an interesting aspect of that kind of reception of the film that we
What are you
weren't quite
working on
prepared.
now? And then I'll let you go. No, I won't let you. You're going to talk to Ernie because when we're done here, we need to get some, um,
Sure. I am going to have to go in a few minutes because I have a meeting, but I am working on a few different things. I'm really, really hoping to work more in fiction. So I have a couple projects in development in the fiction department.
hmm,
I also have a podcast that is quite popular in Brazil, and my company is producing now other podcasts by other, people more in the kind of the political world and the newsy world. So it's other form of narrative, and I love that. And I have a whole strategy within my company to work more with stories around climate. So I'm very
yeah,
interested in that storytelling, and I feel like that's a piece where national identity and this idea of what's important and what's precious and what's prosperity, all of these things are quite crucial to getting the policies that we need to
hmm,
sustaining popular support for them. And I really want to work more on that. So
yeah.
there I have a whole
That's a good
climate and
project.
storytelling strategy within the
Yeah.
company itself as well.
Well, we're all breathing the air that you create in Brazil. I mean,
Exactly.
quite
Quite
literally.
literally. So yes.
Unless you're successful, we're not going to breathe. Other than that, it's unimportant.
Other than that, no
No
stakes at
big
all.
deal. Hey, before we end here, I want to thank Randall Balmer, our dear friend who we've had many times on this program, or it's not a program, but on my podcast, an author, for introducing us to you and to the film. And
Absolutely.
then the only thing I would say is if you have the time sometime, because I know that you'll be interested, you should read my novel, Portofino.
Oh, okay. I would love
Because of
that.
everything I've written in terms of capturing not just my childhood, but it's a work of fiction, and it was very successful when it came out. It's in the UK, it's all over the world. I don't think it's in Portuguese, but it's in a lot of different languages. But you read English. But read
Yeah,
Portofino sometime in it, because from this conversation, I can just tell you that you'd be very interested.
I
You
would
would
love that.
you would
I will.
enjoy it. It's a work of humor written from the point of view of a child.
Okay, I love it already.
So
Okay.
and your kids would like it, and it's not a children's book, but anybody who's involved and invested in parenthood and childhood will totally get it. And you have the language for it because of the movie you've made. You will totally get it.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'll check it out.
And
Frank,
you're
this was such
Italian,
a pleasure.
Portofino, Portofino,
Orofino, yeah, almost.
tutto bene. All right. Well, listen, stay on for 1 minute and please talk to Ernie, my
Yeah,
producer,
I
before
will.
you leave. And I'll just thank you again. This has been great. And I'll do anything I can to help you with whatever project you're working on. Let me know.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate it so much. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah,
Have a
me
good
too. And Ernie will give you my contact information, and we'll and give him yours, and we'll talk.
Will do. Merry
Ciao.
Christmas. Ciao.